things today. Really much less. Morning, afternoon, evening. Oh, it's been one of those days.
Monday?
Oh, Monday, daylight savings, all of the above.
Right, yeah. I echo that.
Yep.
I forgot it was daylight savings, so I got in and woke up and then my phone, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right.
Well, yeah, we all overslept in our house this morning too, so it was like running, and then of course it was snowing, and so the roads were, taking the kids to Albany. It was like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna get there. But anyhow, are we good to go?
Yeah, we are.
All right. Well, we will call to order the Planning Commission meeting for Monday, March 14th, 2022. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We have an agenda in front of us. Are there any changes or additions to be made? No? So I guess we can get a motion to approve the agenda. We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Agenda's approved. We've got the meeting minutes from February 14th in front of us. I guess I didn't see anything that needed changing or updating, so I will make a motion to approve. We've got a motion and a second. Are there any corrections or comments from any other members? No? All right, all those in favor? Aye. All right, meeting, you abstain? Okay. And the minutes are approved. New business in front of us. We've got, looks like new member introductions. I see some new faces.
Yeah, definitely. So I just wanted to introduce a couple of our new members. I'll let them introduce themselves. I know Keith was at the last meeting, but we didn't quite.
Keith Loaji.
Okay. Excellent.
Adam Spaniak.
Okay, great. All right, and I guess, I don't know, do we want to just do a quick run through introduction of everybody here? For
Yeah, that would be
just to make
nice.
sure. All right, I'm Gina Dullinger. I guess I'm chair this year, again.
Surprise.
Bob Rosal, City Council.
Carmen Mick, Vice Chair.
That was a tough meeting.
That was a tough meeting. There was all kinds of things that went wrong in that.
Yep.
Mike Osterman.
Okay, all right. Then we've got the transportation plan update.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. So I wanted to bring forth a transportation update to the commission. This started with a conversation at the staff level where we looked at our future transportation map. So for those that are newer or unfamiliar, we do have a transportation map that was adopted in 2012, and we've updated a few times, but we have not taken a look at our sidewalk and our trail system. So we had a discussion at the staff level and highlighted some different priority connections and some gaps. The council also talked about it at their last work session, where a couple other comments were provided from the council. And those comments are in the memo in your packet. But really just looking to see if the Planning Commission has additional thoughts and input. Briefly, I'll highlight a couple of the different areas that we had talked about. One of the areas, starting kind of from the northwest portion where we have the high priority to the Wobegon, that's just a sidewalk gap. So on the east side of the street, we have a small connection or small gap right now. So when folks come from the Wobegon Trail and off of it, they have to essentially cross over and then continue south because there's no sidewalk or trail that's connecting over there. We also have a connection from along Northland Drive that is a priority. We did some street reconstruction over here where we filled in some of this gap, but the key would be to connect that over to the trail itself. We have another small gap right over here on College, and that gap is essentially where the parking lot is and the apartments right over here. There's a small gap where people have to again cross over and then continue or go through the parking lot. There's no sidewalk there. And then we also have a connection along Baker Street right here that we've identified, and that would connect from 7th Avenue all the way over actually to 20th. So that's a pretty big east-west connection, especially with the future community center and that, and these residential folks needing a safe way to travel along Baker to then get to the community center. That was a key. Couple medium priorities. We have one down here on College Avenue. Right now the trail, that multi-use trail, ends by Kennedy, and it does not connect down to the future what's called East Park. We put that as a medium priority because we don't want to build the trail until we actually have a park that's developed. So once we have a park that's developed, then we would hopefully connect that trail. Staff is working on a grant project for this park that we'll be submitting actually in a few weeks here. And then we have one more other medium priority connection that we've identified up here that would essentially connect Minnesota Street over here down to 20th. The challenge with this one is the county actually owns the right-of-way. So there's greater right-of-way constraints. So I'd be happy to answer questions. Otherwise, again, we're just looking for input on any other connections. The council talked about the importance of having sidewalks on both sides of the streets in the downtown, and then another connection that they had highlighted. So thoughts, questions, concerns? Did we get it pretty right so far? Okay.
Those all seem like reasonable future projects.
Okay. Awesome.
I think it makes sense to wait for that trail to the park until the park has got more development going on. I think that's definitely logical, phasing or prioritization there, for sure.
Okay. Good deal. All right, so that's all I have on that one.
We don't need any actions or anything on that at all?
Nope,
Okay.
just looking for discussion or input, so.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any more discussion or anything, we can move on to old business, wedding event venues within the rural residential areas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So we had some conversation at the last meeting about some brief conversation regarding wedding and event venues in rural areas. Talked about some of the concerns. We also talked about just some of the reasoning and the thought process and what we would have to accomplish. The city, we were approached with the inquiry, so that has made us look into our whole zoning district and areas with specific emphasis on the rural residential area. A lot of the rural residential area that you see, so that's highlighted in your orange color here, those properties were annexed, most of those were annexed in 2018, 2019 into the city. So the typical process for the annexation is they would get annexed as an agricultural property and then potentially rezoned, but they were all annexed as rural residential property. So the question to the commission is, a use like a wedding and event venue, is that appropriate in a rural residential area? There's been, specifically in the last 5-10 years, there's been a lot of conversion of property, like a old wedding or old barn into a wedding venue out in rural areas. So in order to facilitate or allow a use like this, we'd have to amend the code. At minimum, staff would recommend that that use be a conditional use. That gives the city a lot of power to take specific requests and put specific conditions onto those requests. Some other concerns that we had highlighted is minimum acreage requirements. We wouldn't want, like, especially in this clustered area up here where we have rural residential properties that may range from 0 to 5 acres. We wouldn't want some property owner to convert his backyard, shoust or something into a event venue. That would cause a lot of concerns and issues with a clustered development in a neighborhood like that. So minimum acreage requirements is something that we definitely would want to look at. Some of your other typical concerns include parking, screening, landscaping. Another, when we did some brief research, and a lot of other cities also required that a use like this be located on like a collector street. So that'd be like your main streets where the traffic or the handling of traffic would be conducive to a use like this. Again, it would eliminate then like your cul-de-sac developments and your cluster developments, but it would force that use as only allowable on your main corridor type of streets. What else did we talk about? We talked about utilities. Building code has stipulations and requirements for hooking up to utilities to ensure that the event venue is sprinkled, and those are basically triggered at a capacity minimum. So if it's a 300 and above capacity, you'd have to sprinkle it. If it's below that, then you do not have to, I believe. And that's kind of what we highlighted. Again, noise is another one of those potential concerns. So we're, again, really just looking for feedback as you look at the rural residential area and the properties that are zoned accordingly.
Can you highlight on this, or can you maybe point out on this map what would be considered collector roads in these areas? I know obviously 133.
Yep, so it'd be
2, 3.
Yeah, it'd be 133. It would be 2, 121 coming down here. I believe we also do have Jade Road as a minor collector, so we have minor and major collectors.
So it would eliminate something like the 295th Street and the Mullen Road north based on saying just a collector at this
Yeah,
point.
Mullen Road I do not believe is one. 320th I believe may be one.
Is that the city's designation or is that, okay.
Correct, yeah. So those designations would come directly from our transportation plan and map.
Okay.
Yep. And I think that's kind of the thought behind forcing that use onto a street that's just, it's more conducive to, traffic and increases. So.
It's a lot of vehicles going down at certain times, be a lot of traffic going down that road, a lot of wear and tear on the road, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is this for, I guess I look at it and see a couple different scenarios. I see one with it being, there's an existing structure on the property that is being converted in use to a venue, which at that point in time, may or may not already have utilities stubbed to it, may or may not already have some of that stuff. And then I see a new construction of a new venue and a new building or new structure. I think there's some challenges with both of those.
So now on utilities, any of these properties, a lot of them don't have water to them. sure if a septic system versus a well could supply the fire suppression that's required. With utilities itself,
There's always a way to do it.
well, yeah, but, it
But is it
eliminates a
cost
lot of,
prohibitive or is it
a
realistic?
lot of, situations if you require city services. Cause, that's why it's a rural area, as soon as the city services get out that way and it develops, then there will be, but for right now,
And
most
some
of
of
these
the-
properties don't have utilities.
Right, but they may already be hooked up to a private well or a private
Right,
septic
yeah, and I'm
and
not
that kind of
sure,
thing, and
that's
it's, I guess what I don't wanna run into is I don't wanna be that city where there's an existing barn that's being rented out as a wedding venue and there's a fire and people die. I don't wanna be that city. I wanna make sure that the city's got all of their i's dotted and t's
Well,
crossed,
I'm
just
just
from, I
saying
know,
that
but
we-
from that
we shouldn't
standpoint.
require city utilities if it can be
So staff.
handled by
yeah.
others,
So-
systems.
So staff has had that conversation, and historically, we would recommend that they connect to utilities, regardless if it has to be fully sprinkled or not fully sprinkled. So that would be, that's a huge, when you, like you said, when you look at the different properties, that would automatically eliminate a lot of the properties, even if they were to meet other requirements, collector street, minimum acreage, or other things that we would put in there. And that's really to allow, so the city, when we can grow, we grow incrementally, and we're not like piecemealing and allowing a well and septic over here and over here. Well, then 5 years, then utilities come in, and then they'd have to connect anyway and get rid of their septic system. So it's to encourage smart growth types of concepts.
Well, so then that's the question, if you already have that plan, and I'm looking at this plan for the sidewalks, and I know that, some of these are rural residential, but if they get sold, you have plans that, well, they're not gonna be rezoned for that. They can't be rezoned for, I don't know, low density versus, case in point, property next to me. So if that's the case, what property's already off the docket because of the city's plan? I mean, what property are we really even looking at here? Are we talking about, way out, or are we talking within the cluster that's through that middle section here that goes from the backside of, from Jade, then north, in that, where those apartments went up and everything, where you planned to put a road through. Here you're showing a sidewalk to kind of go through that area. So I mean, is it changing, it really does matter what the property is, if it's gonna affect your future plan, correct?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question fully.
Well, because you want they're rural residential, so you wanna use the property to put up an event venue. But the property that you're looking at, if it's right behind, the armory, that's still down further here is rated, as rural residential, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, is that within the plan, if they sell that to have an event venue, or does the city have plans to allow that rezoning? Because, like I said, the property next to me wasn't allowed to be rezoned in a certain way.
Yeah, so to answer that, so that's kind of the question to the commission is, we wouldn't look at rezoning the properties, but we would be looking at adding a wedding or event venue as a allowed use within the rural residential area. So would that meet the city's vision and goals for those areas? It can be argued probably both ways, that a wedding and event venue is more commercial in nature. But again, when you look at how other cities and counties handle it, it's a common thing that the use like that is allowed in an agricultural or rural area. So that's really the question to the commission is, again, is a use like this, do you want to, one, allow a use like this in the rural residential area? And then two, if you were to allow, how would you allow it? Like, what items would you want addressed? Like the ones we talked about with screening, landscaping, traffic, collector street, minimum acreage.
We already have an example, right, with Golden Ridge there, and it's basically kind of the same thing, right? The event center out there where they're basically doing the same thing at a wedding venue out in that area. Now, that looks like it's zoned actually somewhat different though than rural residential, right? It's
Correct,
actually-
yeah, that's
Actually, in the
zoned as
city.
And that started
B2.
that way,
Yeah, it'd
Okay.
be this one right there.
yeah.
Yep, so B2, yeah.
I know there are some noise concerns with that. I mean, I live around Jasmine, and actually we can hear them when they have events out there, and we're probably a mile away, so that is a concern, especially if they're anywhere close to probably residential areas that might be able to hear that. So I think controlling the noise would be a big item as well with that, but, access to it, I think, is a big thing. Utilities would be a really big item, I think getting it out there in cost too, so.
I think it's important also to be aware of the properties, you know, that next tier out being township and not being city, having some sort of consistency between those. We live down County Road 51, you know, Milk and Honey is right on that road. You know, there's days where there's a lot of traffic coming in and out of there. There's concerts at night that, you know, we can hear from our house if we're on those the right nights. And I mean, I think something like that, I love having these places here. I mean, I love having the out in the country feel of a venue, being able to go and hang out with friends and listen to a concert or go to a wedding or have food. I mean, we've done all of the above, and there's definitely something unique about the settings and being in that rural setting or going to a rolling ridge and having that neat barn. And, you know, I mean, I get the attractiveness of those, but I think it's important that we're somewhat, that there's some consistency too between, you know, otherwise it's gonna be two property, if it's a new venue, you're just looking at somebody hopping a couple properties down the road to get out of the city's requirements, and then, I mean, you lose the revenue, you lose the use, but you're still dealing with some of the same things, because you'll still be dealing with the traffic, you'll still be dealing with the noise in the vicinity and things like that. It's a tough one, because if somebody comes and says, if it becomes something that's allowed as a conditional use, and somebody comes to you with a plan, and they can meet the requirements of that conditional use permit, we can't really say no as a city, can we? I mean, at that point?
So, yeah, it would first depend on what is in the standard ordinance, and then second, we can only put what's called reasonable conditions. So those would be kind of the things we've already highlighted with screening, landscaping. But I would say if the commission or staff were to structure a change that in the ordinance itself, that we have a lot of the more major things kind of covered in there with, you know, if it's utilities, requiring hooking onto utilities. So it's allowed as a conditional use, but you need to have a minimum of 50 acres. You need to be on a collector street. So then that way it eliminates a lot of the properties that would be probably more worrisome for a use like this. And then at the same time, we're not necessarily opening up a floodgate or a door in the city for this use in the rural area. So we can kind of control it a little bit better.
Well, I think there's a need to be cautious that you're not imposing, that you have, you know, you could have two very similar uses in similar scenarios, and just because one is zone B2 and one is zoned rural residential, if you're putting a huge onus to require something on the B2 property, but you're not requiring the same in that rural residential, and vice versa, I think that could pose some problems as well. Just something to consider
Yeah.
and to keep in mind.
I'm saying at a minimum, just from what you're saying, the scenic specialties, the venue out there, I mean, they've built, it's already there.
Yep.
So whatever was required, I don't know offhand, but there was,
Yeah,
They're
a
different
lot
though,
of
I
give and
mean,
take on that one. And whatever has been required on that one would have to be required on the, RR designation.
yes and no,
Yeah.
because that was a business, zone business B2 development when that
Right,
went in,
right,
so
but,
it's different, I mean,
Yep.
it's a little bit, it's different, whether it should be or not, it is, I guess.
and I would say, you know, if a code were to be structured, that we would for sure be more restrictive in the rural residential area, just to be cognizant of how that can be more disruptive to others within that district potentially. Again, going back to some of our clustered areas and things like that.
For what I'm saying is, for a base, requirement, the requirements would have to be the same as, scenic specialties in the B2 area. That would be the minimum. And then add on to that for the rural area. Cause then you take into consideration the rural nature of it instead of the business nature. But the requirements for that B2 area would be minimum for anything out in the rural area, as far as setbacks and so forth and so on.
But
My opinion.
there's things that you would require in a B2, like pavement and some of that stuff, though, that you may not be requiring in a rural residential. I don't know, I guess that would be, and I know that there have been some, you know, that there's been a lot of discussion when Rolling Ridge was being developed as to requirements for parking and paving and that kind of thing.
And those have been addressed.
Yep, and they've been addressed, and I think there was some, they've been addressed.
Well, it was
In a way
addressed, and they met the requirement of whatever the, conversation came out to.
And I think
But
it
what I'm
was,
saying is the minimum that is required for them right now is a start point for the rural, the RR area.
but I think you also need to, I mean, I don't disagree, but I think you also need to take into account that your scenarios are a little bit different when you're adjacent to other commercial properties versus, you know, something might be really out of place in the outer skirts of the orange that isn't so out of place in a business area where there's fast food restaurants and retail shopping.
Right, that's
and-
where you address that in the conditional use permit.
Yeah, I
And
think
then
it's,
then you add on to those base requirements for a RR area.
but it may not be add-on. That's, I mean, it's different, I've gotta believe that there's some things that would be different. That
It's a talking point. We can look at what's already there. We can look at the, negatives of it and the positives of it. You know, like you mentioned, parking.
yep,
We can address that parking issue with the RR area. You know, we can always amend the one in the B2 area to require, you know. No, we went through a lot of changes on that one,
yep.
as far as, you know, well, can you do this, can you do that, and, well, I'll do this, if, you know.
I thought it was, and I was reading through some of the rural tourism type stuff that you had provided in our packets. I thought some of those points were interesting. Is there anything in those that you wanted to highlight, Nate?
I think I can't remember which one it was in, but, it was going back to that Collector Street, managing the traffic, that would be a concern. Overall, I think a lot of them, whether they defined it as like rural tourism or, what was it, agro-tourism, I would say their probably definitions is even more wider and more encompassing than what we would be looking at. Cause they talk about a variety of different educational, entertainment types of uses within that definition. So I think if we were to look at a definition, it'd be even more, or it'd be less wide open, if that makes sense. It's kind of interesting. The more and more you look into it, the more and more things you start to think about with the use and potential options on where it could end up.
And with utilities too, getting utilities out to whatever site this would be, it would affect potentially other properties going out to that as well, cause they would be assessed, and I think that was, we went through last meeting a little bit.
Yeah, likely. Yeah, depending on where it's at, it would be correct. Yeah, the others would likely be assessed. There'd be some kind of combination of how that breakdown would look, and each request like that would be unique, just because how many properties are you transpiring to get to the subject property? You know, are you going past 3 properties, 4 properties? What would be the breakdown? That's still something that I think staff would have to try and figure out how we would do that and handle that. But that's a great question.
Well, and I think the need for public utilities to be run out to the property, I don't know that that needs to be a given. I think that there's definitely ways to have an event center, a venue on private septic, private well. I think that, I don't know that, I mean, I definitely don't think we wanna say you need to have public utilities serving the property, because I think that's gonna put a lot of undue burden on the property owner and those along the way.
I agree on that.
You look at, I mean, being a teenager and going to being a teenager, young adult and going to the concerts out in Wisconsin that are, out in a cornfield or out in an old field, and it's, the 3 rows of porta potties. Yeah, you're not talking fire suppression because you're all outside, but I mean, there's ways to meet the needs of a venue without necessarily having public utilities to them, I guess. So I would be very hesitant to make that requirement, that there be public utility connections. But I think that utility services do definitely need to be adequate. I think
Well, they'd have to meet the fire suppression codes, whether, they have 80,000 people with buckets.
or a pond, or tanks, or, there's definitely different means of taking care of it. But yeah, I think that, it needs to be appropriate. I also don't wanna see it happen where you're skirting the issue by saying, oh, we're only a 250 person capacity, and so we don't need to sprinkle, and yet the first time a wedding happens there's 325 people and something happens. I mean,
That's a great point.
it's
That's a great point.
It's an enforcement issue. It's an enforcement issue. It's a liability issue. It's a issue that I think all venues, regardless of where they are, it's something that can be an issue.
If they came in with, 299
right.
capacity, you could always address that with a conditional use permit. That's the catch-all process.
If it's in but if you say you need to meet the building code and they come in at 299, they're meeting building code.
But we still have the conditional use permit to approve it. We can still require that.
But you would have to,
And that argument could be raised very easily, or,
do you have the ability in the conditional use to do that? If they, if you're, I guess I don't know how it would be worded. If you're worded that says, adequate utility service to meet building code requirements or something like that.
Yeah, it would depend on how we structure it within the ordinance itself. As far as additional conditions that aren't in the ordinance specifically, we'd probably have to turn to legal to see if that's a reasonable condition that we could apply to the property.
right, and that would be in the language,
Yeah, I think that's something important to give
Yeah.
to give the city the flexibility, the ability to be prudent in.
It would just have to be addressed in writing somewhere within the ordinance itself.
Yep.
Because we can't make the laws weaker, we can make them stronger. Any state statute, you can't make it weaker, but you can make them stronger in your local, area.
Jurisdiction, yep.
So on this, yellow, gold, or whatever color you wanna call that, you know, there's a lot of properties that can be eliminated right away, the ones that are platted. Okay, and the ones that don't, aren't on the main arterial roads, you can eliminate them. I think, it would be a good, exercise to eliminate, on the map here, to eliminate them properties from the map and use a different color to, this is what's possible in these areas and it's not possible in the other areas. This way we have a smaller window to look at. And then we can kind of address what's around it, what isn't around it. Take a visual and kind of look around and see if that's gonna fit over here. No, because there's cluster here, cluster there, it's too close, it doesn't meet the roads.
Well, I think it would be interesting to see visually what properties we are really looking at as it
Yeah.
being a possibility, because I think there's a lot of, if you were to have a minimum acreage requirement and the requirement to be on a collector road, you're eliminating a lot of the orangish, goldish area, and it would be, I think, a good visual exercise to see what actually isn't excluded. And maybe in a couple scenarios, maybe it's a less, a couple different area, minimum acreage, and then the collector streets.
So, for acreage, does the commission feel one way or another towards a certain minimum acreage? Kind of what staff was, if we take like 50 acres as a minimum acreage, I think there's around, if memory serves me, I did this exercise last time. I think it's like around 18 properties or so that would be 50 acres and greater in the rural areas. So that's of course your bigger ones here. But then if you add on a requirement of collector streets, yeah, that will probably cut that probably at least in half.
I think 50 acres is larger than what it needs to be. I don't think I'd go anything smaller than 20, or anything smaller than 20 though.
I'm
I
just,
just-
I'm just thinking, what is,
I think it needs to be.
what is it, Mullins out in Sartell? What's the acreage on that event center? That's just
Good
kind of an
question.
example.
Yeah, I don't know offhand.
I mean, that would be something to know, just to reference.
Though that's in a more developed,
Mullins and Sartell.
Correct. Yeah, that's off of Main Pinecone
I
Road.
know they have a big parcel in back of them.
Kind of by other commercial.
I don't know how much.
I think it's zoned commercially too.
yeah.
So that's probably kind of like Rolling Ridge, I would say, in a way.
So, yeah, how much is that? How big is that?
I wanna say,
Rolling Ridge.
Yeah.
Oh, that's probably,
is it 14 or?
you know,
I
I
wanna say
could
it's-
I could probably tell you in a second here.
I don't know that we should be putting like an arbitrary number as far as the lot size that these wedding venues should be, because as long as their building is meeting fire code, occupancy code, and their parking lot is meeting the occupancy code that their building is rated for, if that's on a smaller lot, 7-8 acres, and they're meeting sanitation, utility, sewer, they're meeting all their codes, who's to say that they should mandatorily have to have an extra 10 acres of grass? If they're meeting all codes and requirements, I don't think we should have to choose just a large number that fits them.
Well, I think the point is, cause it's rural residential, and all those properties were annexed, they wanna be rural residential, they don't wanna be right next to a commercial property.
At this point, you know, sometimes you wanna be next to a commercial, depending on how far down the road you're looking at.
The point is that it has enough buffer that the noise and the visibility of lights flashing for nighttime dancing.
Headlights coming in and
Headlights
out.
coming up, I mean, that's the whole point, is that there's still some buffer, unless it's in a flat-out cornfield, that there's not a single, but I know there was language about putting
Sorry about the map thing. I don't know what's going on here. I tried to pull up the Rolling Ridge, but yeah, you know, staff's thought on that is kind of what Carmi was saying there, is that yeah, within our rural residential area, we have some properties that are just field and there's no vegetation, no trees, no nothing. And then we also have those clustered areas that have 5 acres, 10 acres, a little less than that. So the thought is that you put on that minimum acreage, so you do have the additional screening, additional setbacks, additional buffers to supply.
But most of those are not on a collector street. I mean, I would say that most of those smaller parcels don't have access aren't accessed directly off of a collector road.
Or gonna be close
Yeah.
to any high-density residential areas.
Right.
Yeah, that's probably accurate.
So I guess, I think one thing would be to pick to have an acreage limit, and one would be to not have an acreage limit, and see what they really are different, because I think your limiting factor is really gonna be that collector roadway. I mean, I think that's what's gonna eliminate, or gonna determine most of which properties we're even really talking about as being a possibility. Kinda hate to go through all of this and then come to find that there's really only, 4 parcels, and is it worth going through the whole process of, developing the requirements for a conditional use permit when you're looking at the possibility of, say, a handful of properties too. I think it'd be really nice to be able to see how many properties or what we're actually looking at as being eligible with that collector. Cause I think the collector road probably makes sense. I think that makes sense. And then I don't know, I mean, I think that may give us our answer right there, what we're looking at, and whether or not you need to have an acreage requirement, cause I think,
The one area I would highlight is probably this area. Again, I'm sorry about my map here, and
no,
I don't know what's happening with that, but 320th and potentially some of these properties, and I don't know what the acreage is here, but just trying to think out loud. But for the most part, other than that, all of our other areas, these are all large properties. Don't have anything over here.
I mean, I
This
think
is a future collector over here, but we got large parcels. We do have St. Cloud city limits residential over here. But yeah,
I mean, I do like the point of having, it's kind of that additional buffer in that rural residential area, rather than just saying whatever you can squeeze on your lot, you can squeeze on your lot. But I do get your point that if you're meeting the requirements, why do you need to have the extra 10 acres of green space? I totally get that, unless the city's goal is to maintain that, as much of that rural residential feel as they can without having a pocket of developed land here and there and everywhere.
Well, once rural residential is developed, it is no longer rural residential as far as,
But it would still be a rural, if they put an event center in currently and had a conditional use permit, it would still stay rural residential,
No.
right? Yeah,
no,
Yeah.
no, then it changes.
so developed. So the way that we look at that is platting, subdividing. If it were to be platted and subdivided, then it would have to be meet our zoning and be zoned to the appropriate zoning
but if
district.
they don't have to do any replatting, then it
No, if they
stays what
don't
it
have to
is.
do any replatting, if they're asking for a rezone, then that's a different thing. But with this, we would have the ability to, if it's something that's allowed, to just insert that as a conditional use, and they can stay rural residential.
But once they build on the property, yeah,
No, because it's still
So,
if they don't
it-
have to replat it.
Yeah, it would be like if someone had a property, smaller property over here, and they wanted to build a new home on it. If there wasn't a home on it, we would allow them to build a new home on there, and it could stay as rural residential because that's a permitted use. We couldn't deny them a permitted use within that current zoning.
I disagree. You go back to the OA agreement. and,
Yeah,
I mean, I sat on that thing for months, and no,
it's,
with the residential designation.
But that
We-
wasn't, that was
we-
in the orderly annexation area though, now, and now it's city.
yeah,
Wasn't
so,
that-
and
There are
we've gone back,
agreements.
we've gone back to, cause we asked this question to legal too, and legal considers it when you develop it, when it's either rezoned, to a different zoning district, or when it's platted and subdivided. Then at that time, it has to meet, you know, the current, but with it just, if you're, cause you can't deny a permitted use in that zoning district. Current zoning always supersedes any future zoning or that. So if it's a permitted use or a conditional use in the rural residential area, then the city would have to allow it per current zoning.
But you take 40 acres, you put an event center up there, and it's gonna change. It's not gonna be rural residential anymore, it's gonna be taxed at the normal tax rate, cause and our area has a different tax, rate than other areas.
Now, that's a different,
Yeah,
That's
now I
a
wouldn't be able to
different
answer
issue.
the tax assessor question. I can definitely try to figure out the answer for that, but that's a good question.
that's, I think,
'Cause
a
I
different
don't-
issue, because I think if
Yeah.
if you've got a 40-acre parcel and you put an event center on it, because it's a permitted use, and you're not replatting it, because you don't need to, because you already have a plat, you know, it already has its parcel ID, and you're not rezoning it, you're not replatting it, and you're putting something on that, no different than, I mean, we're no different than somebody putting up a pole shed on their acreage because it's allowed. It's still rural residential, but you bring up a good point with the use of that property and the tax
Right,
implications of it being used as a revenue generator.
right, then it doesn't fall under RR anymore.
Well,
Well,
the
this-
use may not, but the
I mean,
parcel's still,
Yeah.
read the fine print in
I-
that agreement, it's pretty extensive, when it comes to that.
but I think that is something that should probably be looked at too, because I don't know that it's fair to. I'm be curious to see how that gets addressed when you have something like a more income generating use rather than a residential use in a residential zone, regardless if it's rural residential or not. How that triggers, I mean, I guess, how does a home business, I mean, if you have a home business on a rural residential, but that's not a,
That's a permitted
It
use.
doesn't kick in anything.
right, but I mean, I guess how would, you know, this I would assume would be, well, is it different?
There's a home, isn't there in the rural residential ordinance, there is a home extended business, so there, you have to,
As a conditional use, yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so is it really different, and does the city have the ability to tax it, or is it able to be taxed at a different rate?
So, I mean, yeah, for instance, you know, you have your bed and breakfast inns as a allowed conditional use in the rural area. Yeah, again, your home extended business, public-private schools. So, I mean, there's different, yeah, it'd be a question for the assessor to see how they do handle those, cause there's plenty in Stearns County, for instance, that are zoned.
That covers an existing structure.
Well,
You know, once you build a new structure, the ballgame changes when it comes to designation of a rural residential area.
we're putting up a new barn, it doesn't affect us. I mean, you're putting up a new barn on our property, we're still the old Green Acres fathered in, whatever we are where we're at, but we're putting up a new building, we put up several new buildings on the property,
Where is this at?
down in Collegeville Township.
In
But it-
where?
Collegeville Township. But it hasn't because we
Well,
didn't do any
That isn't in
replanting.
this area.
Right, I'm just saying,
Yeah,
but,
that's a different township.
but I don't think that,
That's a whole different agreement, that's.
that agreement doesn't exist anymore, does it?
The annexation agreement,
The
joint,
OA.
the OA, yeah, we go
Oh,
off
yeah,
of that.
there's
It does
Yep.
still exist. I
Yep.
thought that went away when this.
No.
No, so
Okay.
yeah,
We
so
have a
the,
specific
Okay,
agreement
yeah,
The-
and I,
yeah.
for the annexed area.
Yeah,
That's what I'm saying.
you're right, so I guess that would be something to look at too then, I mean,
Ye-
but I think,
Yeah, so it does have in there, when the property is developed commercially or platted. Now, the question again is,
what's the
Is-
definition of developed commercially?
so, yeah, so I mean,
Buildings.
if this is,
Existing use.
if this is allowed as a
If there's
conditional
existing
use,
then it's fine.
then
If you aren't,
it's allowed in the
putting
district.
more,
Um,
building on the space.
it's, even though there may be some commercial nature to it, the commission would have made the determination that it would be allowed in the current zoning district. So that's, again, the question. If you view it as more commercial, then maybe the commission looks at, well, maybe this isn't a good fit for the rural residential area, because it's more commercial, so we have, concerns on that. But if you can address those concerns, then that's when you would look at, okay, well, maybe we can allow this as a conditional use, but with these stipulations.
I think
So you have the power to really decide and dictate.
We really need to wait until there's a specific request that comes through to look at.
So staff is not necessarily gonna bring this. That would, be a request that would have to come to us, formal request. We have an ordinance amendment application. So if someone were to wish to try to allow this, they would have to submit that formal application, and we would take it to the next level. Right now, we're really just trying to put it in front before, if something gets submitted, we're ahead of the game, and
You don't have that clock ticking on your back while you're trying to,
yeah,
Figure all this
yeah,
stuff
we're
out.
trying to have all these great conversations and great questions now, as much as we can ahead of time.
I think for education purposes, I think the commission should get a copy of the annexation agreement,
Okay.
so they know.
some little light reading. No, I know, I was
It's
on the
pretty
joint board for a
straightforward,
while
except
too,
for-
and
I mean, the
it's-
taxing's a little bit complicated, because that's the number crunchers that do that.
well, I think at the very least, maybe just a summation or
It's
a
not
sum.
that lengthy.
No, I know it's not, but it's
But
got a lot of
it's
legal,
very
it's got a lot of
specific.
legalese in it though.
Yeah, it's got a very,
Yeah.
it's very specific.
For the non-lawyer in me,
I mean, I fairly know what's going on here, not all, but, so you people would know what that annex agreement all entails.
yeah, there's a lot of history with all that, and I think that would be very helpful. And as a refresher even, I mean, I was on the joint board for a while as well, and I think it would be a good refresher, for all of us at least to have that to at least look back at. I guess I was under the impression that it didn't really,
It makes a
wasn't really
difference what
valid anymore,
happens.
but I get it now, that makes sense.
I mean, what's existing is accepted, but it all depends upon what you build, what you don't, if you build, you know.
Well, and I think it would be interesting to see how that might, if it does handle it all, an existing structure and a change of use.
Now, how do we discriminate as far as the use of the property? We got it down as a wedding venue? I mean, is it strictly a wedding venue versus?
So it
Event
depend on
venue?
how we define it. So
That's
yeah,
some muddy waters there.
yeah. So when you look at
As
those
far as
other
legal goes?
definitions that the other counties or cities came up with, is a lot more wider and encompassing. So how we would define it, I don't know. That'd be something we had to really dig into and do research. Is there concerns from the commission if it's not a wedding and event venue, but if it's like some of these other things that are listed in some of these samples, like when it talks about, what's a good example here? Like utilizing like a farm as like a educational space, or
Like a Nelson's Farm in Litchfield kind of a deal or something like that.
Yeah.
Where they take the kindergartners to and go through that, or like a Eden Valley, what's the place in Eden, Mason Farm
Yeah,
kind
Mason
of a
F-
deal.
Yeah, exactly. Would the commission have more concerns for something like that? Would we want to just focus it on wedding and event venues, and, since that's been the bulk of the conversation? I don't know. That's a great question.
Are we specifically talking about a wedding venue, or are we just talking about a straightforward event center?
So,
I mean,
Yeah, so
kinda what I'm kinda
really
getting
how
at.
we've structured, yeah, how we've kind of structured it is more of a wedding,
I think.
a wedding venue. Yep, that's how we've kind of,
See, I
Wedding
would,
or
I would disagree, I would go event center.
It says
Because-
wedding/event.
or yeah, wedding and event center, not necessarily like the other uses like a Mason farmyard or whatnot, but yeah, the wedding event.
Yeah, I
You're
think you
correct.
kind of follow with Stearns County with their event venues, kind of at least build off of that perhaps. I guess we haven't even gotten into anything like, you know, use restrictions, how many events per year and that kind of stuff, but that's definitely something to, it's a way to minimize the disruption to the adjacent parcels.
Mhm.
If you say you can have, you know, well, and I don't know where you start breaking those down, because at what point is that none of our business, and,
So this is the Stearns
Yeah,
County one here?
and
That says 15 days per calendar year. Is this the actual Stearns County zoning options for event venue?
well, that's a temporary, that's their definition of a temporary use, I think,
Okay, temporary special.
but yeah, I guess I'd be curious how things, you know, how things shake out with new building versus conversion of existing structure too, because I think that's, and at what point is that existing structure going beyond existing structure and becomes new structure? I mean, if you have, I don't know how to describe that, so I'm just gonna stop.
yeah, and I mean, going back to, yeah, the X number of days and a calendar year and all that, I mean, any language that staff were to craft or whatever would have to definitely make sure that we can enforce it, right? And especially being cognizant of, well, when we get those complaints, it'll probably fall to the police department. It'll probably be off hours. So we'd need to make sure we have a process in place to be able to handle that, and then effectively and consistently.
Does the township have any type of event?
The township, so they, within the orderly annexation area, we actually control and process the permits. Outside of the orderly annexation area, they would fall back onto the county regulation. So that's like, yeah, milk and honey, for instance, would be under the county. Even though it's in the township, the county would handle enforcement and things of that nature.
Because
So the
that,
township doesn't have a decision and decide?
the township has decided that they're gonna follow the county ordinance
Yep.
requirements, I think is how that.
Yeah, so they
it's
basically
worded.
just adopted the county ordinance as their ordinance instead of having their own separate standalone ordinance and process in that, so.
Not for all things, but for certain things.
Yeah, yep,
Yeah.
correct.
And
For
we
zoning.
still have part of the township in our OA area. We still have an OA agreement. Not for the entire township, but quite a bit. So whenever something happens in that area, that's when that joint board that we had the other night gets together.
Correct. Yeah, so that's why you saw the request for those that are on the joint planning board, because it gets triggered. And it's the OAA agreement is more strict than city, because for a minor thing like a boundary lot line adjustment that we just, reviewed, well, if that was in the city, we would typically handle a lot line adjustment administratively. But that rose to a public hearing and a different process because it's in the OOA. Yeah. And that's really to ensure that those areas that are outside city limits, that they're growing in the way that we want them to grow, and smart growth, and you're not piecemealing things with no coordination.
So for right now, I'd like to see this map cleaned up and, pretty much on consensus here, just start with a minimum of 20 acres, and that's adjustable as we go through this whole process too.
Or, I mean, I don't know that we even need, well, I'm trying to think if it makes sense to even have I guess if we do a breakdown of acreage, you might as,
Yeah, I mean,
I think the
20
collector
20
road is
acres might
probably
be
the-
more than you need, like,
Collector road.
Yeah, I wonder
you
if
know,
you do look
might
at
be
a 10 acre or
10
something.
acres might handle it, you know?
But I think if we look at that collector road issue first,
Yeah.
I think that may
eliminate-
provide enough clarity that we don't even look at the area so much. Or it'll highlight what properties may be an issue with that. So there's that, there is the OAA agreement, kinda getting a copy of that for review and perusal. Some use taxation questions. What were some of the other things that we highlighted? I think the rest of the stuff is, I mean, I think some of that noise and parking and all the buffer and the landscape and that all
that's
works itself
developing
as you go
agreement,
through, that all
conditional
works
use
as you
permit
go through it.
Stuff, you know?
But I think, that can be looked at better when we know what properties we're actually, or what areas we're actually really looking at, I think. Personal opinion, I don't know. So, and we don't, I mean, this was just for discussion at this point too, right?
Yeah, this is just for discussion, and I mean, really, it's up to the commission too. Yeah, there's a couple options. We can, continue the discussion and look at the collector street and all those things that you highlighted. Or we can, you know, we don't have to continue the conversation until something gets submitted to the city, for an ordinance change. So, I can definitely bring back, a revised map that kind of shows some of that.
I think a revised map and a brief discussion at the next meeting would be good to keep us on the same track, and then
Okay.
maybe we can go from there.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm thinking we should label it event center, and I don't think specifically we should target it just for rural residential. We should look where else, you know, I can see it going west. I can see it, being involved east of the, armory in that area. I can see it being allowed in there, you know.
Maybe looking at what can overlap with other areas outside of
Right,
this is
yeah,
rural
I mean,
residential,
just
don't reinvent the
specific
wheel.
target rural residential, might as well do the whole thing at one time to see where, you know, it's allowed under a conditional use permit.
So are you saying like look at other zoning districts too? Cause,
Right, I mean, me, in my position, if someone came in and wanted to put an event center east of the armory, I'd be more than open to it. Or if they came to the western end of the city and wanted to put an event center out there with the acreage, I would be more than open to it, and I'm sure the whole council would be.
So are there other zoning districts where an event center already is it a conditional use or isn't allowed at all?
We would fall back, so in the commercial district, going back to like Rolling Ridge, for instance, that's zone B2, highway commercial, which makes it a allowed use in that district. B1, I believe it's also allowed, I don't know if it's a conditional use in B1.
What's the light pink on this map
The light pink
between frontage road
would
and?
be B3, general
Okay.
business.
Okay,
Where's 134?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now, we have a mechanism for property that is zoned commercial for the use. Industrial, I do not believe it's allowed. So it'd just be the commercial that it's allowed right now.
yeah, cause there's no other residential properties within the city that it would be allowed in,
Nope.
so.
Oh, no, that's 134.
Unless, Bob, you're talking more that orderly annexation area that's not currently in the city, is that kind of the parcels you're talking about?
No,
Or-
what's in
okay,
the city right
okay,
now.
okay.
I mean, like I said, sitting at the council table, if someone came and, or even at this table, if someone wanted to put an event center east of the armory, I'd be open for discussion on that.
But what is that currently zoned?
I believe it's ag right now.
So this is 8th
It's off
Avenue.
the top of my head, I don't, you know.
Isn't this the armory right here?
Yep.
So you're looking east, you're not in the city limits
You're not
anymore.
Correct. Yeah, east
it really
right there
doesn't
is
matter.
not within the city limits. So, I mean, that would fall back on the future land use. If someone were to come to the city and wanna annex that property, we would look at, okay, if you're gonna come in and plat it out, what's our future land use say? And what's the zoning say? And if it says commercial, then it'd be granted. If it says something different, then it won't, it just correspond to what that future land use is.
I think for purposes of this discussion and keeping it, I think if we can flesh out some of the ideas in this rural residential, I think we can look at where else it may need,
Yeah,
be
it's
needed
a
at
start. It's a
later.
start
Yep, I
to
think we
get
start with this
something.
to give it enough of a limit so that we don't chase our tails for the next 3 years.
Okay.
With that being said, then I guess we can move on. Is there other business?
Just a quick update. We have a all boards and commission meeting, next Tuesday, March 22nd, 5:30. Everyone should have got the first email from Therese, our city administrator, that had sent that out. We had that joint planning board last week. We had a quorum for that, so we were able to take action on that item. And then the one thing I can say, I can't say specific property, I can't say specific developer, but I can say that we've been working for months on a future distillery. That's all I can say at this moment. So, that's
Alright.
the highlights.
All right, with that, I guess, I will make a motion to adjourn.
I second that.
We have a motion and a second. Those in favor? Aye. Meeting is adjourned.